Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born in 1918 in the rolling hills of South Africa's Eastern Cape, the son of a Thembu chief and the great-grandson of a king. His given name, Rolihlahla, meant roughly the same thing in Xhosa as his life would come to mean in practice: troublemaker. As a boy, he herded cattle, swam in clear streams, and roasted corn under open skies. He would later describe that childhood as one of genuine freedom. He did not yet know that the freedom was an illusion. His first lesson in how South Africa truly worked came early. On his first day of school, his teacher looked at him and told him his name was unacceptable. He would need a Christian name. From that day forward, the world would know him as Nelson. He was a child. He accepted it. But the quiet erasure of identity that began in that classroom would become the defining injustice of his country, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting it. As the son of a chief, Mandela had access to the best education available to black South Africans at the time, eventually studying at Fort Hare University, where he first encountered organized student protest. His response to unfairness was not to lower his head and move on. It never would be. He moved to Johannesburg in the early 1940s, and the city stripped away whatever remained of his boyhood assumptions. He worked near the mines and later as a clerk in a law firm, watching the daily machinery of racial humiliation grind forward. The pass laws, the segregated spaces, the casual violence of a system that had decided in advance what a black man was worth. It was in Johannesburg that he found the African National Congress, the oldest black political organization in South Africa, and something clarified in him. He had been thinking of himself as Xhosa. The ANC taught him to think of himself as African. The task, he came to understand, was not to protect one tribe, but to build one nation. In 1948, the nationalist government came to power on the votes of the white electorate and made official what had long been practice: apartheid. A word that meant separateness and delivered exactly that: a legally enforced architecture of racial inequality that reached into every corner of daily life. The battle lines were no longer implicit. They had been drawn in law. Mandela and his colleague Oliver Tambo responded by opening the first black law firm in South Africa. It was a deliberate act. If the law was being used as a weapon against black South Africans, they would learn to use it back. Their waiting room was never empty. In 1955, the ANC and allied organizations gathered thousands of people at Kliptown to approve the Freedom Charter, a blueprint for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. Mandela had helped organize it. The government banned him from attending. He watched from a distance as the document he had worked to create was ratified without him. A year later, he and more than 100 other leaders were arrested and charged with high treason. The trial was designed not to convict, but to consume, to keep the opposition tangled in courtrooms and drained of time and energy. It dragged on for 4.5 years. It did not break him. The government had tried humiliation, restriction, and legal exhaustion. Mandela had tried patience, law, and negotiation. Neither side had moved the other. The country was approaching a crossroads, and one side was about to make a decision that would change everything. On the 21st of March 1960, in a black township called Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg, a peaceful crowd gathered to protest the pass laws that controlled where black South Africans could live and work and move. The police opened fire. 69 people were killed, most of them shot in the back. The government's response was not remorse. It was martial law. The ANC was banned, thousands were jailed. Every legal avenue that remained had now been closed. Mandela drew the only conclusion left. Peaceful protest had been met with bullets. The courts had been used as traps. The ballot box was not available to him. For a man who had spent a decade working within the system, the decision to abandon that approach was not made lightly. But when a government declares that it will answer nonviolence with massacre, nonviolence alone becomes a different kind of surrender. The armed struggle had begun. He went underground, moving across the country in disguise, organizing sabotage operations targeting government infrastructure while avoiding civilian casualties. The newspapers called him the Black Pimpernel. The government called him a terrorist. To millions of black South Africans, he had become something else entirely, proof that resistance was still possible. It could not last. In August 1962, he was captured, charged with leaving the country illegally, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then things got worse. While he was already imprisoned, police raided a farmhouse in Rivonia and seized documents that implicated Mandela in the armed struggle. He was brought back to court. This time, the charge was sabotage. The potential sentence was death. He stood in the dock and chose not to mount a defense. He chose instead to make a statement. He told the court he had fought against white domination and he had fought against black domination. He described his ideal of a democratic and free society in which all people lived together with equal opportunity. And then he said the words that would echo for the next 3 decades, that it was an ideal for which, if necessary, he was prepared to die. The courtroom was silent. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. He was 45 years old when he arrived on Robben Island. The prison sat in the cold waters of the Atlantic off the coast of Cape Town, close enough to the mainland to be visible on a clear day, far enough to feel like the edge of the world. He was given the number 466 of 1964. He was assigned to break rocks in a lime quarry under the open sun, work so brutal and so pointless it was designed to do one thing: to reduce a man. It did not reduce him. In the quarry, between the guards and the silence and the stone dust that damaged his eyesight permanently, Mandela turned prison into something the government had not anticipated. He taught. He listened. He counseled younger prisoners who arrived angry and left with a philosophy. His cell became, quietly, a university. His moral authority, far from being extinguished by captivity, grew steadily in the dark. Outside the island, his wife Winnie kept the flame burning at enormous personal cost. Harassed Jan, banned, and eventually imprisoned herself, she remained a living symbol of the struggle while her husband's face could not even be legally published. They had taken his freedom, his family, his name, and replaced it with a number. What they had miscalculated was this: a man who cannot be broken by suffering cannot be made irrelevant by silence. The world was beginning to notice, and it was only going to get louder. The years on Robben Island did not pass quietly. They accumulated. 1 became 5, 5 became 10, and the world outside the prison walls continued to turn, while Nelson Mandela broke rocks and wrote letters that were censored before they arrived and received visits that were counted and timed and conducted through glass. For years, the government refused to release a single photograph of him. The most famous political prisoner in the world had no face. The intention was to make him disappear. It had the opposite effect. Inside the island, Mandela studied. He completed his law degree by correspondence. He read, argued, debated, and continued to lead with the quiet authority of a man who had decided that the only thing the prison could not touch was his mind. When the government offered him conditional release in exchange for renouncing violence, he refused. The offer was made more than once. The answer was the same each time. He would not purchase his freedom by legitimizing the system that had taken it. Outside, the struggle found other forms. Oliver Tambo led the ANC in exile, building alliances across Africa, Europe, and beyond. Around the world, ordinary people who had never been to South Africa and never would began to feel that something monstrous was happening there, and that silence made them complicit. Boycotts spread. Universities divested. Musicians refused to play Sun City. The sports fields that white South Africa loved were emptied of international competition. Slowly, painfully, the country was being made a pariah. Then in June 1976, the children of Soweto marched. Students protesting a government order that they be taught in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors, were met with live ammunition. The images went around the world. Hundreds died. Thousands more took to the streets in the weeks that followed. The townships burned. The nationalist government clung to power with increasing brutality, but something had shifted. The beginning of the end had arrived, even if the end itself was still a decade away. Through the 1980s, the violence inside South Africa deepened. States of emergency were declared. International pressure intensified. Banks began withdrawing loans. Sanctions tightened. The Free Mandela campaign had become one of the most recognizable political movements on Earth. His name on walls and concert stages and parliamentary floors across the world. While the man himself remained on the island, then later in Pollsmoor prison on the mainland, still a number, still a prisoner, still refusing to break. What the government had not anticipated was that Mandela was negotiating from his cell. Secret talks began in the late 1980s between Mandela and senior government officials. He did not consult his colleagues before initiating them, and he did not ask permission. He had decided that the time had come, and he moved accordingly. The talks were tentative and slow and conducted in the language of men who had spent decades on opposite sides of an enormous hatred. But they continued. By 1989, the nationalist government had a new leader in F.W. de Klerk, and the arithmetic of power had changed irreversibly. The economy was suffering, the townships were ungovernable. The world had turned its back. On the 11th of February 1990, after 27 years, the gates opened. He was 71 years old. His hair was white. He walked out into the sunlight with his fist raised, and Winnie's hand in his, and the watching world exhaled. A man had gone into that prison in 1904. Something larger had come out. The hardest part, it would turn out, was still ahead. The man who walked out of Victor Verster prison in February 1990 had every justification to be consumed by rage. 27 years taken. His children grown without him. His country still in the hands of the men who had put him there. And yet the rage, if it existed, was nowhere in his public face. What was there instead was something rarer and in many ways more unsettling to those who had imprisoned him. A man who had decided that bitterness was a luxury South Africa could not afford. The negotiations that followed were the most dangerous years of his life. The apartheid government was dismantling itself, but doing so slowly, and armed factions on both sides were determined to prevent a peaceful settlement. Right-wing white extremists threatened civil war. Violence between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party was killing thousands in the townships. The country stood at the edge of catastrophe, and Mandela stood in the middle of it, holding together a coalition of grievances that had decades of justification behind them, asking people who had suffered enormously to choose the harder path. He did not ask them to forget. He asked them to decide what kind of country they wanted to live in. On the 27th of April 1994, South Africa held its first free and democratic elections. People stood in lines that stretched for miles. Some had waited their entire lives for the moment. Nelson Mandela, at 75 years old, cast his vote for the first time. Days later, he was elected the country's first black president. At his inauguration, he stood before a watching world and said that never again would this beautiful land experience the oppression of one by another. The generals who had once imprisoned him stood in the crowd in their uniforms and saluted. His presidency lasted one term by his own choice. That choice mattered as much as anything he did in office. In a continent where power was rarely surrendered voluntarily, Mandela stepped down after 5 years and handed over to his successor. The lesson he was teaching was not subtle. Democracy was not a destination, it was a practice, and it required someone at the top to model it. Before he left office, he had established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which offered perpetrators of apartheid-era violence the chance to confess in exchange for amnesty. It was imperfect. It satisfied no one completely. It was also one of the most remarkable acts of institutionalized forgiveness the modern world had seen. The alternative was vengeance, and vengeance would have burned the country to the ground. Then there was the afternoon in 1995 when he walked onto a rugby field in Johannesburg wearing a Springbok jersey, the emblem of white South Africa, and presented the World Cup trophy to the winning captain. A single image. A stadium of 60,000 people, mostly white, chanting his name. A nation that had been held together by force, discovering it might be held together by something else entirely. He retired. Then retired from retirement. He threw himself into the fight against HIV/AIDS through the 46664 campaign, named for his prison number, turning the wound of his captivity into an instrument of advocacy. He established foundations. He raised money for children. He kept working. He died on the 5th of December 2013 at the age of 95. The tributes came from every corner of the earth and from people who disagreed about almost everything else. That in itself was the measure of the man. He had been given every reason to divide, and he had chosen, every single time, to repair. The boy who herded cattle in the Eastern Cape Hills, who was given a stranger's name on his first day of school, went on to give his country back its own. His life proved something that history rarely confirms, that one person's refusal to be broken can change the course of a nation. But he never claimed the victory as his alone. Thousands suffered alongside him, and thousands more never made it to the other side. The walk to freedom, he always said, is long, and it is never walked alone. Please subscribe so I can keep making these documentaries. See you next time.